There's an island in Japan that appears on maps but shouldn't exist. A 16-acre rock in the middle of the ocean, 15 kilometers off the coast of Nagasaki. Seen from a distance, it looks like a battleship run aground in the sea. That's why they called it Gunkanjima, Battleship Island. But get closer and you'll see something different. 10-story concrete buildings rising directly from the cliffs, empty windows staring at the ocean, collapsing structures being devoured by rust and sea salt. There's an island in Japan that appears on maps but shouldn't exist. A 16-acre rock in the middle of the ocean, 15 kilometers off the coast of Nagasaki. Seen from a distance, it looks like a battleship run aground in the sea. That's why they called it Gunkanjima, Battleship Island. But get closer and you'll see something different. 10-story concrete buildings rising directly from the cliffs, empty windows staring at the ocean, collapsing structures being devoured by rust and sea salt. In 1974, 5,259 people lived on this island. It was the most densely populated place on Earth, more crowded than Hong Kong, more concentrated than Mumbai. There were schools, hospitals, cinemas, temples, shops, a complete vertical city built on a rock in the ocean. Then, in April 1974, everyone left in a single day. The lights went out, doors were left open, personal belongings were left behind, and the island fell silent. Hashima has been abandoned for 50 years. The Japanese government prohibits entry. The buildings are collapsing, the concrete is cracking, the ocean is slowly devouring everything. But this isn't just a story about a ghost town. It's a story about what happens when you build the future on the backs of people who have no choice. About a company that owned not just the land, but the lives. About workers who died in the dark extracting the coal that fueled Japan's modernization. And about how, when the coal ran out, everyone simply forgot they existed. This is Hashima, and this is the story Japan tried to bury. Hashima started as nothing, a barren rock 480 meters long by 160 meters wide, emerging from the East China Sea. No fresh water, no soil, no vegetation, just volcanic stone exposed to wind and waves. Nobody lived there because nobody could. For centuries, fishermen from Nagasaki used Hashima as a reference point. The rock appeared on nautical charts but was essentially useless, just another outcropping among the hundreds that dotted the Japanese coast. That changed in 1810. Local residents discovered coal veins exposed in the island's cliffs. High-quality coal, coal that burned hot and clean, coal that was in growing demand as Japan began to industrialize. Early mining was primitive. Workers rowed to the island in small fishing boats. They extracted coal from surface veins using hand tools. They carried the coal back to the mainland in baskets. The work was dangerous. Rocks fell, waves swept men off the cliffs, but the profit justified the risk. For decades, mining on Hashima remained an artisanal operation. That changed in 1890 when Mitsubishi bought the island. Mitsubishi was one of Japan's zaibatsu, massive industrial conglomerates that controlled entire sectors of the economy. Founded in 1870 by Yataro Iwasaki, Mitsubishi started with shipping, then expanded into mining, shipyards, manufacturing, banking, and more. By the late 1800s, Mitsubishi was one of the most powerful corporations in Asia. When Mitsubishi looked at Hashima, they didn't see a rock with some coal. They saw deep reserves of high-quality anthracite that could fuel Japan's warships, factories, and power plants for decades. They also saw a problem. The island was too small to support industrial mining operations. It needed to be expanded. The solution was brutal engineering on a monumental scale. Mitsubishi began building seawalls around the entire perimeter of the island. Concrete walls 10 meters high, designed to withstand the typhoons that regularly struck the region. Inside these walls, they dumped landfill. Tons of rock, concrete, and debris dropped from the mainland. Inch by inch, Hashima grew. From 1890 to 1931, the island expanded to nearly double its original size. The natural shape of the rock disappeared under layers of concrete and fill. The new land allowed Mitsubishi to build infrastructure, mine shafts drilling deep into the rock, ventilation systems to pump fresh air into the mines, cranes and conveyor belts to move extracted coal, power generators, desalination facilities to create fresh water from seawater. Then came the apartment buildings. The first residential buildings on Hashima were constructed in 1916, 9-story concrete structures, the first in Japan. Vertical construction was necessary. The island had limited horizontal space, so they built upward. More buildings followed in the 1920s and 1930s. Eventually, the island would have over 30 concrete apartment blocks, some over 10 stories tall. They were built so close together you could reach out a window and touch the neighboring building. The apartments were tiny. Average family units measured 10 square meters, a single room with a shared kitchen at the end of the hallway, no private bathroom. Families of 4 or 5 lived in spaces smaller than most garages. But by the standards of the time, having any housing was better than the alternatives. Workers came to Hashima from all over Japan, desperate for employment during economic crises. Mitsubishi offered wages, housing, and guaranteed work. The fact that this housing was a concrete prison cell on a rock in the ocean was secondary. The population grew rapidly. In 1916, 3,000 people lived on Hashima. By 1941, over 5,000. At its peak in 1959, the population reached 5,259. This made Hashima the most densely populated place on Earth. Population density exceeded 139,000 people per square kilometer. For comparison, Manhattan has about 27,000 per square kilometer. Even the most crowded neighborhoods of Hong Kong or Mumbai didn't come close. Every person on Hashima worked for Mitsubishi or was dependent on someone who did. The company controlled everything, owned the buildings, operated the stores, ran the schools, employed the doctors, provided the water and electricity. If Mitsubishi decided you should leave, you left. There was no appeal, no alternative. The island was private property, and Mitsubishi made the rules. This was the arrangement. Mitsubishi provided everything, and in return, you extracted coal from the bowels of the rock until your body gave out. Coal mining is one of the most dangerous occupations humans have ever invented, and coal mining on Hashima was particularly brutal. The mines extended hundreds of meters below sea level. The deepest mine reached 1,000 meters below the ocean's surface. Tunnels branched in all directions, following coal veins through the rock. Temperatures in the deepest levels exceeded 30 degrees Celsius with 95% humidity. The air was suffocating, even with mechanical ventilation. Workers sweated constantly. Dehydration was common. Heat exhaustion killed regularly. Shifts lasted 12 hours, sometimes more. Miners descended in industrial elevators that transported 30 men at a time, packed into the metal cage. The descent took several minutes, stopping at different levels as workers exited for their assigned stations. In the deepest levels, tunnels were less than a meter high in some places. Miners worked on hands and knees or lying on their sides, extracting coal with pickaxes and pneumatic drills. Darkness was absolute beyond the lamps on their helmets. The noise was deafening. Pneumatic drills hammering stone, conveyor belts screeching, fans roaring, men shouting instructions that could barely be heard. After years working in the mines, many went partially deaf. Coal dust filled everything. Workers breathed it constantly. It accumulated in their lungs over months and years. Pneumoconiosis, black lung, was practically guaranteed for anyone who spent enough time in the mines. The condition was irreversible. It gradually destroyed lung capacity until breathing became an agonizing struggle. Mitsubishi knew, everyone knew, but there was no treatment and no compensation. It was just the cost of working in the mines. Accidents were constant. Rocks fell without warning. Equipment failed. Tunnels collapsed.
Methane gas explosions occurred when ventilation failed and a spark hit pockets of accumulated gas. Each explosion killed dozens. Bodies were recovered when possible, sometimes they weren't. Entire tunnels were sealed with the dead still inside if recovery was too dangerous. Families were notified. They received a small payment. Replacement workers were brought from the mainland. Operations continued. Official death records were minimal. Mitsubishi didn't maintain public statistics on worker fatalities. Exact numbers are impossible to determine, but estimates from survivors and researchers suggest hundreds of deaths over the decades of operation. That was in normal times. During World War II, things got drastically worse.
In 1939, Japan was deeply involved in World War II. The country's imperial ambitions in Asia required massive resources: coal, steel, ships, munitions. The war machine needed fuel. Hashima's mines operated at maximum capacity, but there was a problem. Japanese workers were being conscripted for military service. The workforce was shrinking exactly when demand for coal was increasing. The government's solution was forced labor. Starting in 1939, Japan began transporting Koreans and Chinese to work in the mines. These workers were not volunteers. They were civilians from occupied territories, rounded up by Japanese authorities under the labor mobilization system. Korean families were separated. Men were put on trains and ships with no explanation of where they were going or for how long. Many never returned. Between 1943 and 1945, an estimated 500 to 800 Koreans and Chinese were brought to Hashima. Exact numbers are disputed because Mitsubishi destroyed many records after the war. Conditions for forced laborers were significantly worse than for Japanese workers. They were housed separately in even more overcrowded areas. Food rations were smaller. Shifts were longer. Safety equipment was minimal or non-existent. Abuse was systematic. Japanese supervisors used violence to enforce production. Beatings were routine. Workers who complained were beaten publicly as a warning to others. Attempting escape was impossible. Hashima is a rock surrounded by ocean. The current is strong. The water is cold. There was nowhere to go. Some tried anyway. They drowned. Mortality rates among forced laborers were substantially higher than among Japanese workers. Estimates suggest that between 122 and 200 Koreans and Chinese died on Hashima between 1943 and 1945. That represents a mortality rate of 15 to 40% in just 2 years. Causes of death included mining accidents, malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. Medical records from the period show men working to the point of complete collapse. When the war ended in August 1945, surviving forced laborers were finally released. Most returned to Korea or China. Many were permanently damaged. Lungs destroyed by coal dust. Bodies broken by years of brutal labor. Psychological trauma from inhuman treatment. Mitsubishi never formally apologized. For decades, the company denied outright that forced labor had occurred on Hashima. Only in 2015, under international pressure, did a Mitsubishi executive acknowledge for the first time that Koreans had been brought against their will and forced to work under harsh conditions. This was not an apology. It was a minimal acknowledgement of historical facts. No compensation was offered, no responsibility was accepted. The Japanese government has been equally evasive. Hashima was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2015 as part of Sites of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution. The inscription emphasizes technological innovation and industrial development. It mentions forced labor only obliquely and only because South Korea demanded it. UNESCO required that Japan create an information center about forced labor as a condition for heritage designation. The center finally opened in 2020. It minimizes the extent of abuse. Exhibits present forced labor as unfortunate but not exceptional. Korean survivors who visited the center described it as insulting and historical revisionism. This is the legacy Japan prefers to forget. Hashima represents not just industrial success, but brutal exploitation. Not just technological development, but human rights atrocity. And when the island was abandoned, that history was left to rot with the buildings.
To understand Hashima completely, you need to understand it wasn't just a mine, it was a company town. Everything on Hashima existed to serve the mining operation, but people still had to live there. Daily life on the island was strangely normal and deeply alienating at the same time. Children grew up never stepping on solid ground. They attended Mitsubishi-run schools, played in concrete courtyards between buildings, and learned that concrete walls and ocean defined their entire world. There were no cars. The island was too small. You walked everywhere you needed to go, climbing up and down worn concrete staircases through narrow alleys between buildings that blocked sunlight most of the day. The island had shops, a department store operated by Mitsubishi, grocery stores, a bakery, a butcher, all with prices controlled by the company. If Mitsubishi decided to raise prices, there was no competition. You paid or went without. There was a hospital, small, poorly equipped. Doctors did their best, but serious injuries or severe illnesses meant boat transport to Nagasaki. When the sea was rough, which was frequent, no boats came. You waited or you died. The island had recreational facilities because Mitsubishi realized that completely miserable workers were less productive. There was a cinema, a small swimming pool, pachinko parlors, a Shinto shrine, a tennis court on the rooftop of one of the buildings. These amenities existed but were inadequate for a population of 5,000. The pool held maybe 20 people. The cinema had 200 seats. For most residents, recreation meant staying in your tiny apartment or socializing in the alleys. Alcohol was ubiquitous. Bars and sake shops occupied the first floors of many buildings. Men drank after shifts because there wasn't much else to do. Alcoholism rates were high. Women on Hashima had rigidly defined roles. Some worked in support positions at the mining operations, sorting coal above ground. Others worked in shops or the hospital. Most stayed home, raising children in impossible spaces.
Domestic life was brutally difficult. Apartments had no private bathrooms. You used the communal toilet at the end of the hallway. No private showers. You went to the public bathhouse. Privacy essentially didn't exist. Cooking was done in communal areas or on small kerosene stoves in your room. The smell of cooking fish, fermented cabbage, and miso permeated every corridor. Ventilation was minimal. In summer, the heat inside the concrete buildings became unbearable. The walls between apartments were thin. You heard everything: conversations, arguments, sex, babies crying, illness, death. Nothing was private. Children played in the alleys and on the rooftops. The rooftops were particularly popular because they offered open space, but they were dangerous. There were no railings. Children occasionally fell and died. The water around the island was deep and the currents strong. Body recovery was difficult. Storms were terrifying. Typhoons regularly hit the region. When one approached, the entire island was put on alert. Windows were sealed, everyone stayed inside. Waves crashed over the seawalls, throwing salt spray hundreds of meters inland. The noise was deafening. The buildings swayed. After severe storms, damage was extensive. Broken windows, flooding on lower floors. Occasionally, parts of buildings collapsed. Mitsubishi maintenance crews repaired essentials. Cosmetic damage was ignored. The island had no natural soil. No trees, no grass. Everything was concrete and rock. The only green came from small potted gardens some residents kept on their windowsills. Tomatoes, herbs, nothing substantial. Just a reminder that the natural world still existed somewhere beyond the sea. Mail came by boat. Food supplies came by boat. Everything came by boat. When weather worsened, nothing arrived. The island had emergency stores, but if a storm lasted several days, rations got tight. Living on Hashima meant accepting you were isolated, separated from normal society, subject to forces beyond your control. You woke up, worked in the mines, returned to your tiny apartment, and hoped nothing went wrong because there was nowhere to run. And yet, people built lives there. They married, had children, celebrated festivals, created community. Humans adapt. Even in the most alienating circumstances, we find ways to make life bearable. But that adaptation came at a cost. Hashima survivors often speak about the sense of relief they felt when they finally left the island, as if a weight they hadn't realized they were carrying had been lifted. Hashima wasn't a home, it was a prison with wages. The 1960s brought changes Hashima couldn't survive. The global energy industry was shifting. Oil was replacing coal as the primary energy source. It was cleaner, more efficient, and increasingly cheaper. Hashima's coal reserves were also depleting. Decades of intensive mining had extracted the most accessible veins. What remained required deeper, more dangerous, and less profitable mining. Mitsubishi conducted economic analyses. The numbers were clear. Continuing operations on Hashima was becoming unviable. The company began gradually closing parts of the mine in the 1960s. The island's population began to decline, from over 5,000 in 1959 to about 4,000 by 1970. Workers were transferred to other Mitsubishi facilities. Families left when they could find work elsewhere. Then, on January 15, 1974, Mitsubishi made the official announcement. The mine would close in April. All residents were to evacuate. The notice was minimal, 3 months to dismantle entire lives. Families began packing. Mitsubishi provided some relocation assistance. Workers were offered positions at other company facilities on the mainland. Some accepted, others found work independently. What they couldn't take was abandoned. Furniture was too large for the boats. Appliances were too heavy. Books, photographs, clothes, everything that didn't fit in a few suitcases was left behind. Pet animals were released or left. Cats went feral. Eventually, they died. On April 20, 1974, the last boat left Hashima. Aboard were the final residents and the last of Mitsubishi's maintenance staff. They left the lights on. They left the doors unlocked. They simply left. Mitsubishi locked the entrance gates and posted no entry signs around the island. The company retained ownership but had no plans for the space. No buyers were interested. Who would buy a rock covered with collapsing concrete buildings 15 kilometers out in the ocean? For years, Hashima existed in limbo. Technically private property, legally prohibited, practically forgotten. The ocean began reclaiming the island immediately. 50 years of abandonment have transformed Hashima into something surreal. Sea salt is incredibly destructive to concrete and steel. Every wave that hits the seawalls throws salt spray across the island. Every storm soaks the buildings in salt mist. The salt penetrates the concrete, reaches the steel reinforcement bars inside, and begins corrosion. Steel expands when it rusts. This creates pressure from inside the concrete, causing it to crack and spall. The process accelerates with each storm. Hashima's buildings are exploding from the inside out. Roofs have completely collapsed on several buildings. Exposed steel beams are twisted and rusted. Concrete slabs hang at impossible angles, held only by rebar that hasn't completely rotted away. Entire floors have crumbled. What were once apartments are now just piles of concrete rubble and twisted metal. The exterior walls show enormous holes where sections collapsed. You can see straight through buildings, viewing the ocean through opposing windows of hollow structures. The staircases, the only means of vertical movement, are collapsing. Steps have fragmented. Railings have come loose. Climbing the buildings is now potentially fatal. Inside the apartments that remain accessible, decay is comprehensive. Floors are covered in debris, chunks of ceiling, disintegrated plaster, rusted steel, broken glass from windows that exploded during storms. Personal objects remain where they were left. Empty sake bottles, cracked rice bowls, children's shoes, school blackboards still hanging on walls, final lessons erased but still visible. Textbooks have disintegrated into piles of pulp. Fabrics have rotted. Plastics have become brittle and crumbled. Nature has made limited incursions. Weeds grow in cracks where concrete is broken enough to allow soil. Seabirds nest on ledges and windowsills. Their droppings cover interior surfaces, adding acid to the corrosive mixture already destroying the buildings. But Hashima will never truly go green. There isn't enough soil. The environment is too hostile. Trees can't establish roots in solid concrete. Salt kills most plants. This leaves the island stuck. Not fully natural, no longer functional, just a slow, corrosive ruin. The island's infrastructure is also failing. The seawalls that protected Hashima from waves for a century are cracking. Sections have collapsed, allowing waves to hit building foundations directly. Eventually, maybe in 20 years, maybe in 50, the ocean will bring down the remaining buildings. Hashima will return to what it was, a barren rock in the sea. For decades, Hashima was completely inaccessible. Mitsubishi and the Japanese government prohibited entry. No boats went there officially. The island existed only in aerial photographs and fading memories. That changed in 2009. The city of Nagasaki began offering carefully controlled tourist tours to Hashima. Visitors can see only a small, safe section of the island, a concrete pier and a designated viewing area. You cannot enter the buildings. You cannot explore freely. You stand where you're told, listen to a 30-minute guided lecture about industrial history, and return to the boat. The tourist experience presents Hashima as fascinating and tragic, an architectural marvel, a monument to industrial ambition. The guide mentions coal mining and hard life, but avoids specifics about forced labor or mortality rates. Thousands of tourists now visit annually. They take photos, post on Instagram with hashtags about haunting beauty and urbex. Hashima has become a selfie location. In 2015, Hashima gained UNESCO World Heritage status. Japan included it as part of its Sites of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution inscription, a collection of sites showcasing Japan's rapid industrialization from the late 1800s to early 1900s. The UNESCO designation sparked immediate controversy. South Korea strongly objected, arguing that recognizing Hashima without fully acknowledging forced labor was historical revisionism. After intense diplomatic pressure, Japan agreed to establish an information center about forced labor as a condition of the UNESCO listing. The center opened in 2020, 5 years late. Korean survivors and historians who visited described it as inadequate. The exhibits present forced labor as an unfortunate aspect of wartime necessity, not as systematic abuse. The language is vague, the suffering is minimized. The tension reflects a larger issue. Japan struggles with how to remember its imperial past. Acknowledging atrocities fully would require confronting uncomfortable truths about national identity and wartime conduct. So, instead, Japan presents sanitized versions. Industrial achievement without exploitation. Modernization without mentioning who paid the cost. Hashima has become a symbol of this conflict, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that represents both technological progress and human rights violations, a tourist attraction built on graves. Hashima will not last much longer. The structural decay is accelerating. Engineers who've assessed the buildings give them perhaps 20 to 30 years before critical failures make the island genuinely dangerous, even for the limited tourist access that currently exists. The Japanese government faces a dilemma. The island is historically significant enough to warrant UNESCO protection, but too damaged to feasibly restore. Estimates for comprehensive restoration run over $100 million, money the government doesn't want to spend on a site most Japanese prefer to forget. The most likely scenario is continued controlled decay. The tourist pier and viewing area will be maintained as long as possible. The buildings will be allowed to collapse gradually. Eventually, safety concerns will force the closure of all access. Then, Hashima will return to complete isolation, a crumbling monument visible from the mainland but untouchable. The buildings will collapse one by one over decades. Eventually, only rubble will remain. The land will return to the sea,
Or more accurately, the sea will reclaim what was briefly taken from it. But before it disappears completely, Hashima serves a purpose. It stands as physical evidence of truths that are easy to deny when they exist only in documents and testimonies.
The buildings prove that thousands of people lived in conditions most would consider inhumane. The mine shafts prove that workers descended into dangerous deaths daily. The memorial stones, placed by Korean survivors and families, prove that people died there whose names Japan would rather not speak. Hashima is inconvenient. It disrupts narratives about Japan's modern miracle, about the voluntary nature of wartime labor mobilization, about the benevolent corporation providing for its workers. The truth is visible in the crumbling concrete. This wasn't a city built for people's benefit. It was a machine for extracting maximum labor with minimum cost. The buildings weren't homes, they were worker housing designed with the same consideration given to industrial equipment. People were inputs in a production equation. When the equation stopped balancing, the inputs were discarded. This isn't unique to Japan or Mitsubishi. It's the logic of extraction capitalism made physically visible. Hashima is unusual only because the entire operation was concentrated on a single isolated island that was then abandoned completely, leaving the evidence intact. Most industrial exploitation is dispersed, normalized, or demolished when it becomes inconvenient. Hashima remains because demolition is expensive and the ocean is doing the work for free. Peter Widener built Linwood Hall to establish his legacy. He wanted his name remembered, his taste celebrated, his wealth immortalized. The people who built Hashima had no such ambitions. They didn't choose to be there. They worked because they had no alternative. They died without monuments. Their names aren't inscribed anywhere except in family memories that fade with each generation. The corporations that profited from their labor moved on. Mitsubishi is now one of the largest conglomerates in the world. It makes cars, air conditioners, electronics. The company's annual revenue exceeds $30 billion. The coal mining division that operated Hashima is a footnote in corporate history. The coal that came from Hashima powered Japan's industrial rise. It fueled the ships that fought World War II. It generated electricity for cities. It heated homes. It made possible the economic miracle that transformed Japan from a war-devastated nation into the world's third-largest economy. Every bit of that coal was extracted by human hands, carried on human backs, through tunnels that collapsed on human bodies, in heat that destroyed human lungs, under conditions that shortened human lives. The numbers are impossible to know precisely because the people who kept the records destroyed them or never kept them at all. But we know enough. Hundreds dead from accidents, hundreds more from disease and exhaustion, thousands permanently damaged. For what? So that Mitsubishi could profit, so that Japan could modernize, so that the people who made decisions in boardrooms and government offices never had to think about the cost being paid in the dark, 1,000 meters below the ocean. Hashima is being forgotten because remembering is uncomfortable. The tourists who visit see an exotic ruin. The Instagram posts call it hauntingly beautiful. The government presents it as heritage, not horror. But the buildings remember. The mine shafts remember. The ocean that is slowly reclaiming everything remembers. And the survivors remember. The Korean men who were forced onto boats as teenagers and worked until they collapsed. The children of Hashima who grew up in concrete cells and thought that was normal. The miners who spent their youth underground and their old age struggling to breathe. Some are still alive. Most are not. Within another decade, all first-hand witnesses will be gone. Then, Hashima will exist only in photographs and documents and fading tourist visits, a curious artifact, a place that seems impossible, a city on a rock that thrived briefly and died suddenly. The story will be simplified, the complexity will be lost,
The individual lives will become statistics. The suffering will become distant. This is how history works. The physical structures decay, the witnesses die, the corporations rebrand, the governments craft new narratives, and eventually no one is left who can say, no, it wasn't like that, it was worse. So before Hashima disappears completely, while the buildings still stand and a few survivors still live, the story needs to be told completely. Not the sanitized version, not the tourist-friendly version, the true version. A company bought an island and turned it into a machine for extracting coal and crushing lives. Thousands of people lived there because they had no choice. They worked in conditions that killed them slowly or quickly. When the coal ran out, everyone left. The buildings are collapsing. The ocean is reclaiming the land. And the world calls it heritage. Hashima, the island the world abandoned, because remembering would mean confronting what we built, how we built it, and who paid the price. The buildings will fall, the island will disappear, but the questions remain. What did we sacrifice for progress? Who decided that sacrifice was acceptable? And when we look at the ruins of Hashima, are we looking at history or at ourselves?